Professional Diploma in Wine Appreciation. We have set our foundations in previous lessons, and now we're going to look at your guide to tasting white wines. My name is Julia Blaine, and I will be your educator for your Professional Diploma course in Wine Appreciation. So in today's lesson, we are going to have a look at how white wine is made. We're going to look at a guide to tasting white wine, and then we're going to look at some classic cultivars and examples of white wines. So white wine is made from white grape cultivars. And these cultivars normally ripen a little bit earlier in the season than red wine cultivars. It is, however, possible to make white wine from red grapes by having basically zero skin contact with the red grape skins, because we have learned by now that the color of the wine comes from skin contact. It's also possible to make white wine on the skins, and this is called orange wines, but we will look at this style of wine in a later lesson. So in a nutshell, what really separates the way that white wine is made from how red wine is made is that in white wine, it is the juice only that is fermented. In other words, the juice is separated from the skins and fermented on its own, whereas in red wines, the juice is fermented with the skins in order to extract anthocyanins, tannins, and flavor. In the production of a bottle of wine, the roles played by the vineyard and by the cellar cannot be separated from each other, and I think one is justified in saying that the winemaking process starts in the vineyard. One of the most critical and difficult decisions that has to be made during harvest time is when to pick the grapes and how to determine whether or not they are perfectly ripe in order to satisfy the specific wine goal. The entire year's work of tending to the vines, making sure the soil is healthy, managing when to irrigate, monitoring pests and diseases and the elements of nature, all lead up to the moment when the decision is made to pick the ripe grapes. The question here is, when do we know when grapes are ripe? Determining when the grapes are ripe and ready to be picked is a complex decision with many factors. It includes a chemical analysis of the grape juice, as well as a lot of experience and deep knowledge of grapevines to determine when to pick. Overripe as well as green grapes or underripe grapes will have a detrimental effect on the eventual quality of the wine. When determining when to pick grapes, there are two categories of analysis. Quantitative, which is a measurement of the quantities of particular constituents present in a substance, and qualitative. In chemistry, this is the identification of the constituents, for example, elements or functional groups present in a substance. So let's look at what these two things mean when it comes to making wine. In quantitative analysis, we take a representative sample of the grapes in the vineyard. These grapes are then crushed and the juice is analyzed in a laboratory. We look for an analysis on their sugar content. We look at a chemical analysis of the pH levels in the juice, and we also look at the acidity levels. As the grape ripening season progresses, sugar accumulates in the grapes, and samples are taken regularly and analyzed for their sugar content. The unit of measurement for sugar content in grapes is called degrees Brix. This is probably one of the most common quantitative parameters used when determining when to pick grapes. The pH of juice will give an indication of the stability of the wine at the end of the fermentation, and it will also impact the nature of the microorganisms that can drive alcoholic fermentation, as yeast and bacteria cells are sensitive to pH. There are a few types of acids that naturally occur in grape juice. When a lab analysis is done on grape juice to determine the acid content, it is measured in total titratable acidity. Acidity is important for the structure of the juice and thereby the resultant wine, and it also affects the pH. When determining whether or not to pick grapes on the chemical analysis, one looks at the relationship between these parameters and not at one in isolation. At the end of the day, the goal is to create a balanced wine, and this is why the relationship between these parameters are important. The sugar level will determine how much ethanol is produced. The acidity influences the structure and the freshness of the wine, as well as its stability in terms of pH. It is important to note that some of these elements can be adjusted depending on the wine laws. There are many qualitative analyses that can be done to aid in determining grape ripeness, but in today's lesson we will only discuss two. Qualitative analysis refers to a physical analysis of the individual grape in terms of what we see and what we taste. Understanding these analyses takes experience and knowledge of the vineyard, and it's important to note that each winemaker has their own philosophy when it comes to determining ripeness. One example of qualitative analysis is berry firmness. The berry becomes softer as it ripens. Underripe berries are rock hard and overripe berries are soft and they start to look at raisins. So it's really important to get the sweet spot. Another thing that we can look at is the seeds of the grape. The grape seeds, when they are underripe and before they've reached ripeness, they are really green, and when you bite into them, they are very harsh. But once they start to ripen, they turn brown and they can even develop a slightly nutty flavor. The most important element when it comes to determining when to pick grapes is to taste the grapes. This is where your experience comes in, and like I mentioned before, each winemaker has their own philosophy and their own way of determining when the grapes are ready, and it also depends on the intended style of the wine at the end of the day. Some winemakers will go on a chemical analysis alone, but others will use a combination of what it says from the laboratory and what they've experienced when they tasted the berries. Once the decision has been made that the grapes are ripe and the cellar is prepared, it's time to pick. Grapes can be harvested in two ways, either mechanically or by hand. Grapes that are picked by hand are normally intended for more premium wines, as the bunches are picked individually and in smaller lots, so the grapes arrive at the cellar practically undamaged. Machine harvesting is a different story. It is much less labor intensive, and you can pick a lot more in a shorter time. The mechanical harvester essentially shakes the grapes off of the vine, and the grapes do break in this process, which is unfavorable for the production of premium wines because the juice starts to oxidize. Once the grapes arrive at the cellar, it is time for them to be processed. As we only want to ferment the juice when we are making white wine, the grapes will need to be pressed in order to separate the juice from the skins. Once the juice is pressed, it will normally go into a settling tank for a certain amount of time. The purpose of settling is to get rid of any large particles that might have come through the pressing process. We call these particles matter other than grapes, or MOG. Once the juice has settled, normally overnight, then it will be racked and transferred into a vessel in which it will ferment. You might have heard a new word there, so let me just explain. Racking is the process of transferring clear settled juice, or must, from the sediment. Must is another word that we use in the wine industry for grape juice. By now we know that yeast cells are responsible for alcoholic fermentation. Once the juice has been transferred into a vessel in which the fermentation is going to take place, it is time for the winemaker to decide on the specifics of the fermentation. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the strain of yeast that is most common in the alcoholic fermentation process, which is the conversion from must into wine. This yeast, along with other strains, occur naturally on the grapes and probably in the cellar as well. This means it is possible for the alcoholic fermentation to occur spontaneously in the must without any intervention from the winemaker. This is called a spontaneous or wild fermentation. Some winemakers prefer this method as it is more minimalist in winemaking, and it allows nature to determine the end result. The risks, however, associated with this approach is that you don't really know which strains of yeast are present and if there are enough cells to tolerate the alcohol that will develop. So you might actually get stuck at the end of the day with a stuck or a sluggish fermentation. The alternative is to inoculate the must with a commercialized yeast strain. You can calculate the dose of Saccharomyces cerevisiae that you add to the must, and thereby you have a greater chance of a successful fermentation. Once the yeast has been added or not, and the fermentation starts, the must will start to bubble and foam, and the wonderful aromas of fermentation will begin to fill the air. The yeast cells will start to convert the sugar into ethanol, and they will consume oxygen in order to survive. A byproduct that is produced in alcoholic fermentation is carbon dioxide and heat. During this process, the winemaker is working tirelessly to ensure that the environment is conducive towards the survival of yeast cells. The winemaker guides this process by stirring, adjusting temperature, aerating if necessary, and ensuring there are enough nutrients for the yeast cells to survive. Fermentations are monitored closely and checked multiple times a day. If you have decided to inoculate your must, the fermentation process from start to finish can take anything between 10 and 14 days. In some cases where the approach of the winemaker is minimal intervention, fermentations can tick on for a couple of months before reaching completion. The factors that determine a successful fermentation are plentiful, and we will discuss these later in the module. Once the must has fermented into wine, the yeast cells will die and form a sediment at the bottom of the bottle called fermentation lees. Once the wine has settled, it is time to rack the clean wine off of this lees and into a maturation vessel before bottling. Now, for white wine, a maturation vessel can either be a stainless steel tank, an oak barrel, or an amphora. Sometimes concrete vessels are also used. The decision of what maturation vessel to use is up to the winemaker, and it depends on what the desired outcome of the wine is. In wine production, all the flavors and aromas are derived either from the grape itself, the fermentation process, or the maturation process. No artificial additives are allowed, so oak is relied on as a kind of seasoning for grapes. When the wine is matured in oak flavors combine with the already existing flavors in wine to create a whole new spectrum of flavors. Exposure to oak can impart flavor compounds into the wine, such as vanillin, mentioned in the previous lesson. Oak also contains tannins, which can impart into the wine and adds to the mouthfeel. Along with adding flavor and texture, there are two other benefits of oak. One is microoxygenation. Oak is porous and it allows for little microdoses of oxygen into wine. This will make wine less astringent, and it also results in a smoother mouthfeel. Oak is also a vessel for secondary fermentation. Some wines will go through a secondary fermentation called malolactic fermentation. This is where malic acid, which is harsh, like that found in a green apple, is converted into a softer lactic acid, like that is found in yogurts. This chemical reaction is driven by the Unococcus uni bacteria. Now, batonnage is a French term which defines an act that is often carried out when white wines are chosen to mature in oak barrels on their lees. In other words, the wine has not been racked off of the lees and put into a maturation vessel. It most likely fermented in the barrel, and therefore its fermentation lees is in the bottom of the barrel. So when the winemaker decides to do a batonnage on the barrel, he will insert a special tool in the barrel and he will stir the lees back up into suspension into the wine to extract flavor, aroma, and texture. So the amount of time that wine will mature in oak or in any other vessel is also decided by the winemaker. The winemaker will regularly taste the wine, and when the wine is ready, the decision will be made to bottle the wine. Guys, please remember, if you have any questions during this course, don't hesitate to contact us at support@shoreacademy.com. Right, so now that we've just touched on the basis of how white wine is made, let's look at some guides for tasting white wine. White wines can be classified into 5 main categories or styles, and we will look at examples. There are also guides out there that can help you categorize the wine according to color, flavor, and aroma. Why don't you go and have a look at our bonus material that's available for this course, where we have designed a flavor and aroma wheel to use to help you out. So let's look at 5 groupings or categories of white wine. We get light and zesty, like Grenache Blanc and Pinot Grigio. And we get herbaceous, which is light-bodied and herbaceous that has characteristics of grass or bell pepper, like Sauvignon Blanc and Vermentino. We also get bold and dry white wines like Chardonnay and Viognier. These are normally oaked wines as well. And then we get light and semi-sweet wines, which are light-bodied, aromatic, and fruity, normally with a touch of residual sugar, like Chenin Blanc and Riesling. These are just broad categories, and we need to keep in mind that although some cultivars exhibit certain characteristics that naturally put them into a certain style or category, some wines can be made in multiple styles. Chenin Blanc is an example of this. It can be light and sweet, but in some regions it can be light and zesty. These categories are just guidelines, and we have to understand that terroir will play a role in the end result of your wine style. So to recap from the previous lesson, we learned that the first step in a sensory analysis of wine is to look and note what we see, and that we can get an idea of the style of wine by just looking at it. So what can the color of a white wine tell us? Here are a few things we can look at. Color and light. When you tilt your glass forward in front of a white background, you can see the light shining through the wine. Here you can notice the clarity and the brightness of the wine. A wine that is crystal clear and bright will suggest that the wine is lighter bodied and it has been filtered, and it most probably didn't mature in oak. A wine that looks a little bit duller with a yellowish hue, with slight particles floating in it, might have been matured in oak on its lees with some batonnage, and it could also be unfiltered. Intensity of the wine color can hint towards the richness of a wine. Chardonnay is a really good example here. A light, zesty, and unoaked Chardonnay will have a pale yellow color when compared to a rich and bold Chardonnay that has been matured in oak, which will show more of a golden hue. Once you've identified the main color of the wine, try and look to see if there are any hues that you can pick up. White wines that have a greenish hue to them tend to be a little bit more savory, with flavors of green pepper or lime, whereas white wines that have a golden hue tend to display fruity notes, such as apricot and pineapple, for example. White wine tends to change color as they age. Older white wines will get darker with age, and they will develop a little bit of a brown hue. There are many color charts available out there which can help you in describing or identifying your wine colors. We introduced the concept of flavor and aroma in white wines. Below are some of the factors that influence the flavor and aroma of white wine. Firstly, let's take a look at the cultivar. Each grape cultivar has got a unique physiological makeup with trace amounts of aromatic compounds present in the grape. These aromatic compounds are liberated and enhanced during the process of alcoholic fermentation. Although terroir doesn't have a flavor, it does affect how the grape grows and matures, and thereby influences the flavor and aroma. For example, we had a look at cool climate Sauvignon Blanc versus warm climate Sauvignon Blanc and the characteristics that they might exhibit. We know that as the ripening season progresses and the grapes ripen, the sugar content increases and the acidity in the grape decreases with ripening. The picking date thereby determines the amount of ethanol that will be produced, as well as the structure of the wine in terms of the natural acidity and pH. The decisions of the winemaker can affect the outcome of the wine and determine its style. One of the main influences is whether the fermentation will occur spontaneously with native or wild yeasts, or whether the fermentation will occur via an inoculation with a selected commercial yeast strain. We also have to consider the fermentation vessel. If the winemaker decides to ferment his Chardonnay in an oak barrel, it will taste very different to a Chardonnay that was fermented in a stainless steel tank. The way that the wine is matured will also influence the style and the flavor of the wine. This includes whether or not the wine has interacted with oak, clay amphora, a concrete vessel, or stainless steel. Each of these vessels will influence the flavor and the style of the final product. And when conducting a sensory analysis, it can be useful to use an aroma and flavor wheel, such as the one that we designed at Shaw Academy, which is available in your bonus content, as a tool to help you identify flavors and aromas, good ones as well as the bad ones. The process of alcoholic fermentation is a very sensitive process, and it needs to be carefully monitored. There really is a lot that can go wrong. Previously, we've discussed some common wine faults like cork taint, cooked wine, oxidized wine, and wine turning into vinegar. These are flaws that can occur in all wines. So in addition to this, let's have a look at some more. Sometimes if the wine has been bottled with some residual sugar or RS, the wine can start to ferment again inside the bottle. This isn't dangerous at all to consume, but unless you are intentionally drinking a sparkling wine, the bubbles shouldn't be there. This isn't always a mistake though. Some traditional wines are naturally lightly fizzy. For example, Fizzantes that you can find in Italy. Have you ever seen little crystals in the bottom of your wine glass after you've had a glass of chilled white? These are all sometimes called wine diamonds, and they are tartrates. And don't worry, they are completely harmless. These tartrates, or potassium bitartrate, is also known as cream of tartar, the same stuff that you can find in many kitchens. They are formed naturally when potassium and tartaric acid, which is a naturally occurring grape acid, bond together and they precipitate. The formation of these tartrates, which might explain why you see them in white wine that has been refrigerated. Wine diamonds can occur in red wine and white wine, but seeing as white wine normally contains more natural acid than reds, they might be more common in white wine. So although these wine diamonds are harmless, a lot of winemakers don't want them to form in their wines, as it can put consumers off. So before wine is bottled, it can undergo a process in the cellar called cold stabilization. Simply put, wine is put into a tank where it is cooled down so that the tartrate crystals can form, and then it is racked off. Coming up next, in our lesson 6, we will look at your guide to tasting rosé wines. So we've now covered how white wine is made and some examples of styles of white wine that's out there and factors that influence the style of wine. Now let's look at some examples of these styles. If we are looking for white wines that are light and zesty, we can look at cultivars like Grenache Blanc and Pinot Grigio. These wines are light-bodied and dry. Let's have a look at Pinot Grigio as an example. Pinot Grigio is also known as Pinot Gris, and it is actually a mutation of Pinot Noir. The grapes are often grayish or pinkish in color, and they are mostly used to produce light and zesty white wines. This cultivar is particularly successful in Alsace, France, and known as Pinot Grigio in Italy. Pinot Gris in France can be a highly textured wine with high alcohol, moderate acidity, and ripe exotic fruit, whereas in Italy, they tend to pick the grapes much earlier for a lighter and more zesty style. This is the style that has become very popular throughout the world. When we look at the color of Pinot Grigio, it exhibits hues of pale gold. And aromas and flavors we can expect almond, honey, and ginger, and on the palate, notes of lime, lemon, green apple, and peach. As the wine style is very light and zesty, keep the food pairing quite fresh. Think white meats like fish or shellfish, or foods that have elements of citrus. When serving Pinot Grigio or other light and zesty wines, we are wanting to serve it really nice and cold between 8 and 13 degrees Celsius in a white wine glass, and there is no decanting necessary. Did you know that Pinot Gris grapes can also be used to make rosé wine because of that pinkish or grayish color of the grape skin? We will learn more about this in lesson 6 when we talk about rosé wines. Our next stylistic category of white wines are your herbaceous wines. These wines are light-bodied with herbaceous characters like freshly cut grass or green bell pepper, like Sauvignon Blanc or Vermentino. Let's take a closer look at Sauvignon Blanc for an example. This cultivar originated in Bordeaux, France, and it is also known as Fumé Blanc in some areas like California. This cultivar makes light-bodied wines with powerful herbaceous aromas that are often described as green, like freshly cut grass and green bell pepper. The expression of these characteristics is highly dependent on the climate or terroir in which these grapes are grown. Like we've discussed earlier, the difference between cool climate and warm climate Sauvignon Blanc will be more green notes versus more tropical gooseberry and passion fruit notes. Herbaceous wines are normally described as crisp, dry, and refreshing. The color of this wine is normally a medium yellow with a golden hue if it has seen some oak. The aromas and flavors that we can expect is climate dependent, like we have said. In a cool climate, we can expect aromas of freshly cut grass and green bell pepper, whereas as we are moving into warmer climates, we can experience more gooseberry or passion fruit. And in our flavor spectrum, anything from melon to passion fruit, gooseberry, peach, and grapefruit. Food that pairs well with Sauvignon Blanc is goat's cheese. Because of its intensity, it can be paired with a variety of dishes and it complements many flavors. Generally, it goes well with fish and white meats, as well as Mediterranean flavors and herb-based sauces. Once again, when serving, we want to go for nice and cold between 8 to 13 degrees Celsius. We would like to use a white wine glass, and no decanting is necessary in this wine. Did you know that Sauvignon Blanc was actually one of the first wines to be bottled with a screw cap in commercial quantities, especially in New Zealand? The next stylistic category of wines that we will look at are your bold and dry white wines. These white wines are fuller bodied, aromatic, and intense. They are normally oaked as well, like Chardonnay or Viognier. Let's take a closer look at Chardonnay. Chardonnay is one of the most popular grape cultivars, and it is planted almost anywhere where wine grapes are grown. The grape originated in Burgundy, France, and typically Chardonnay is actually quite neutral, and therefore the flavors of the wine are mainly attributed to the influences of terroir and oak. This is also why there is so much variety in style for Chardonnay grapes, from crisp Blanc de Blanc Chardonnay to rich, buttery oaked Chardonnay. In cool climates, Chardonnay tends to be lighter bodied, whereas in warmer climates, the wines can be full bodied and bold. Chardonnay is often oaked, and in these cases, it will actually undergo malolactic fermentation. These elements account for the buttery and creamy characteristics that one finds in an oaked Chardonnay. When we evaluate the color, we can expect hues of pale to deep gold, depending on the oak influence and the style of the wine. Typical aromas and flavors that we can find in Chardonnay from a cool climate present notes of apple and pear, whereas warmer climates can present notes of citrus, peach, and melon, and in really warm climates we can get notes of fig and some tropical fruit. Oaked Chardonnay can exhibit flavors of tropical fruit like pineapple, mango, and the addition of oak flavors like vanilla and butter. Unoaked Chardonnay actually resembles a Pinot Grigio or a Sauvignon Blanc, but it doesn't have the characteristics of the green flavors, so this is how you can tell them apart. When you're drinking an oaked Chardonnay and you're wondering what to eat with it, think seafood pasta or pork with applesauce. Think about foods that have less spice and intensity that will accentuate the creaminess. And when you're looking at an unoaked Chardonnay, this leaner, crispier style lends itself more towards delicate flavors. Think oysters or sushi. When serving Chardonnay, we're also going to look at nice and cold between 8 and 13 degrees Celsius. And if we are going to be drinking an oaked Chardonnay, we want to use an aroma collector glass. Remember, this gives maximum exposure to oxygen so that these lovely aromas we want to pick up in this oaked Chardonnay can become accessible and will be collected in the airspace of the glass so we can really appreciate them. An unoaked Chardonnay, conventional white wine glass will do, or your universal glass, and no decanting is necessary for these wines. Did you know Chardonnay grape actually originated from a small village of Chardonnay in France? The name originally meant place of thistles or thistle-covered place. So the last category of white wines that we'll be discussing today are our light and semi-sweet white wines. These are normally light-bodied, very aromatic and fruity, and they normally have a little bit of residual sugar or RS, like Chenin Blanc or Riesling. Let's take a closer look at Riesling as an example today. Riesling is a German grape variety that originated in the Rhine region in Germany. This is a highly aromatic grape variety with very perfumed and floral notes and a very high acidity that lends itself to be sculpted by terroir very easily. It is mostly used to produce dry, semi-sweet, sweet, and sparkling wines, so there's a lot of variety in this cultivar. In cooler climates, like in many German wine regions, Riesling can display apple and tree fruit characteristics. Its high acidity is often balanced just with a touch of residual sugar. In warmer climates, such as in Alsace, France, the grapes ripen much later and therefore develop notes of citrus and peach. The high natural acidity of Riesling grapes gives the wine exceptional aging potential, and this allows for secondary and tertiary aromas and flavors to develop, such as the highly recognized petrol characteristic in German Rieslings. This wine is very seldomly oaked. When we look at the color of Riesling, we can expect to see a medium straw color, which will turn more deep yellow with age. Aromas and flavors that we can expect in Riesling wines are like aromas of lime, jasmine, and as it ages, it develops that petroleum aroma, and on the palate, we can expect flavors of beeswax, apple, and lime. This wine is a very versatile wine to pair with food due to its varying style as well as a touch of RS. Think once again white meats and seafood, and this is actually one of the few wines that will go well with aromatic curries and Thai foods. When serving this wine, we'd like it to be ice cold in a white wine glass, and once again with no decanting. So when you're wanting to buy a German Riesling and you're wondering, how do I know if this wine is dry or not, look out for the German word trocken, which means dry. The world is ever changing, faster than we ever realized, and statistically the job you will do in the future is most likely not the same job you qualified for originally. In order to future-proof your career, you need to strive to constantly update and diversify your skill set. We are in the digital age and are at the point in history where higher education is not only available for an elite few anymore. At Shaw Academy, we believe that students can build your own credentials, design your own learning, and develop a multitude of skills. So why not think about what you might want to do beyond this module or beyond this course even? At Shaw Academy, we offer different memberships that will fit to your lifestyle and learning pathways to enable you to build your own skill set. After this lesson, I challenge you to try a white wine along with our aroma and flavor wheel and tell us about your experience in pictures or words. #ShawWine. Well done on getting this far in your professional diploma in wine appreciation, and I'll see you